the two main focus that we have are very much on schistosomiasis and malaria, and we are expanding now and looking at ways also to approach antimicrobial resistance. As I said, we are an R&D engine to start with, but with the pediatric praziquantel formulation, what we realize also is that we can no longer just be an R&D. We have also to think very carefully about the next phase, the access aspect. Because actually when you're talking about the whole R&D and implementation path, you're talking quite often about a valley of death, right? The famous translational aspect where you're losing a lot of compounds. Well, I would argue that actually we are facing in NTD and innovation for NTDs with a number of valley of death, and maybe access is one of them. Okay, just a few words about what is the social business in our understanding. Well, that's actually, we're lying just right between philanthropy and a full business type of approach. We are there to develop products that are going to be affordable to assure their long-term sustainability. Okay, so it's a hybrid model. And for us, it's very important. So now, let's zoom on to the schisto aspect and the pediatric formulation. So Merck has been engaged into the fight against schistosomiasis for quite a while. And this covers the London Declaration, the increase in the Praziquantel donation program, now aiming at reaching over 250 million tablets per year to be delivered in a number of African countries. We're also supporting the Global Schisto Alliance. And from our institute, we are really focusing onto these R&D questions about how to address gaps that we have identified. One of them being a pediatric formulation for praziquantel to treat preschoolers. The other one is actually what you heard this morning about with the drug discovery type of activities that my colleague Thomas is conducting in the institute. But also we are looking at other type of gaps, such as the diagnostics field. And we have a number of our partners here in the room with whom we're discussing on how we can develop and we should develop the next generation of diagnostic to better understand the prevalence but also the impact of the treatments in the schisto domains field. Other activities, we're also exploring new biomarkers to really try to tackle that question more in depth. When it comes to the pediatric praziquantel, well, actually we are doing that under the form of a consortium. And this consortium has a very clear vision. It wants to reduce the global disease burden of schisto in preschool-aged children. This is a target population that has been lacking treatment, and yet this is a very vulnerable population. The mission of the consortium is to develop, register, and provide at not-for-profit cost a suitable formulation of praziquantel. Okay. So the consortium was created in 2012, and we have a number of partners here. It's not just about Merck. It's actually Astellas, Swiss TPH, Pharmanginos, SCI, Ligature. Some other members left, such as SIMSIP, and some others came in, Camry and the University of Félix Houphouët-Boigny quite recently. And to conduct this work since 2012, we have been very lucky because we have had quite nice relationship with some key donors, and we have been awarded a number of grants coming from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also GHIT and EDCTP, of course. The aim of the consortium is, as I was saying, to develop an innovation. It's a pediatric formulation. This is an oral dispersible tablet that should have a much improved palatability and will allow to have access, and by its size will be acceptable for very small children. We are aiming to have a market authorization application by 2020 and to have the product available in some African countries by 2021. So it's basically tomorrow. And that's the point. Because I think what has happened is that the consortium has been rather successful at going through what I call the developability cliff. I'm not sure it's proper English, but it's exactly what it is. You know, we talk about the valley of death in research between the preclinical to the early clinical phase. But really, once we have passed that one, what we see in development is that you do have the major hurdles of facing what? Facing the manufacturing issues. You need to have an affordable drug at the end, so the cost of goods needs to be very low as early as possible into your manufacturing system, and the manufacturing process needs to be extremely lean. Easy to say, not so easy to do. A number of projects are failing there. We need to conduct safety and efficacy trials in endemic countries, and this is for registration purpose, so this is under extremely regulated environment also. And in endemic countries, and I believe a number of you have had this experience, there's also hurdles of capacity buildings, there's a number of issues of registration, a number of issues with consent forms, etc. It's a task that is actually very challenging. And here you have the layout of the current clinical trials that the consortium has managed over the last couple of years. And this goes from phase 1 case studies, as well as we're finishing the phase 2 studies now, and the data are going to be available by summertime for the community. And we're currently preparing phase 3. All those have been conducted in different African countries. So we are managing. Not easy, but it's manageable. And of course, there's the regulatory strategy path. And here again, it requires a lot of discussion with the health authorities. Health authorities that may or may not be necessarily informed and aware about the limitations of conducting some of those trials in endemic countries, and also the knowledge, the in-depth knowledge of the disease, schistosomiasis. Since when there was a clinical trial really conducted for schistosomiasis for a regulatory and a registration process, right? And all that comes with, of course, the key question, the funding, and the funding, right? But here I would argue that for the last couple of years, with the increased awareness of the need to really fulfill the gap in funding for research and development, a lot of agencies have put NTDs such as Schisto on their radar. And that has been the case for EDCTP, that has been the case for GHIT. And so we happened to come to a point when the soil was matured, the ground was fertile to have this conversation with the organization, having the necessary funds, and we were successful to have that conversation. So I would argue that today, in terms of R&D, although it's not sufficient, there are now some degree of fundings that are supporting the communities to move forward. But now, what is the next real challenge for the consortium? And I would say that this is really the access path. This is today a completely uncharted territory to ensure really the access of an innovation in the schistosomiasis environment. That's what I call the access bumpy road. An access program, immediately we think, you know, let's not forget the mission of the consortium. The consortium has for mission to ensure a decrease in the burden of the disease. So that means that the patients, the preschoolers, need to be treated. So the first thing that you think about is, how are you going to implement that locally? It's all about this distribution implementers. Who are going to be the implementers in that story? And conducting conversation with different organizations, with child health days programs, or even primary care programs locally, we can see that we can create synergies rather than reinventing the wheels in terms of implementation. But this is a work that needs to be constructed. But even before that, to make sure that it's implemented, that means that at the policy level, the countries have onboarded this innovation and this product. that we have the proper discussion with the policymakers in various countries to assure that this is taken up. Then comes the famous question of supply. How are we going to supply this? What is going to be the best approach for supplying that innovation into the key places to be sure that it's implemented? So when you ask those questions, or when you are in the access field in NTD, I think those questions of implementation and supply are very common topics. Very common topics that you are going to find for donation programs, right? Essentially, with the Praziquantel donation program, those are the key questions that we do have also. But where I believe there is something very specific about an innovation that is not going to be donated, but that needs to be bought and needs to be secured for the long term, it's the question of procurement. Do we have a procurement mechanism in place that is going to ensure the proper supply in the countries? And today the answer is no. Today we need to look at the global funds of this world, the Gavi of this world, see what are the mechanisms that are in place. Can we learn from them? Can we invent? Because we have to invent pretty much a new innovation, a new procurement system actually. And we need to understand what are the elements that are driving that procurement system. So this is where we are at. And I would say that for us, we are tackling this through a task force within the consortium, where we're trying to address some of those various elements. But also on top of this, I would say, there is another more fundamental question. When you are developing an innovation for NTDs, it requires an extreme amount, a very large amount of funding, right? Not only the development, but also this procurement aspect. Because when you look at the models of the Global Fund, what you see is that actually there are donors that are ready to provide funds to support a mission of this organization to supply the various goods into the countries. Today the question is, who are those donors? And who could be the donors for such an endeavor as supplying an innovation in Schisto? So I'd like to conclude by simply saying that, to me, access path for NTD innovations is going to require a very strong thinking and discussion with the community, with a number of stakeholders, because it does require an innovative approach in terms of procurement, not only for drugs, but also for diagnostics. And I think if we bundle those, this is going to be even more powerful. Beyond that, it does require also provision of particular funds for that, and that is a gap, actually. I don't believe that people have really thought carefully about that aspect of the procurement. And it does require also a revision of the incentives. There's a lot of discussion about how do we incentivize partners to continue getting into, fostering innovation for NTDs. And this is another type of topic that I believe is part of the access, but is at a much broader level. And I think some of my co-panelists today are going to be discussing about this. So with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention.